Luke 12 through 26. Luke 6, 12 through 26. Again, page 49 in that black Bible. I'll read our passage and then we'll do our study. And it was at this time that he went off to the mountain to pray. And he spent the whole night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles. Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John and Philip and Bartholomew, and Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot who became a traitor. And he descended with them and stood on a level place, and there was a great multitude of his disciples, and a great throng of people from all Judea and Jerusalem, and the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon, who had come to hear him and be healed of their disease, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured. And all the multitude were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing them all. And turning his gaze on his disciples, he began to say, Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed you who hunger now, for you shall be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men hate you and ostracize you and cast insults at you and spurn your name as evil for the sake of the Son of Man. Be glad in that day and leap for joy. For behold, your reward is great in heaven. For the same way their fathers used to treat the prophets. Verse 24. But woe to you who are rich, for you are receiving your comfort in full. Woe to you who are well fed now, for you shall be hungry. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you. For the same way their fathers used to treat the false prophets. It's called The Ordinary. The Ordinary. It's a fancy seafood restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina. Here's a little bit about the restaurant. Go on the website, and this is what it says. The Ordinary is a southern seafood hall and oyster bar located in an old bank in Charleston, South Carolina. Our menu celebrates the Marriar of the coastal Carolinas and the East Coast, and we strive to support local and regional fishermen, crabbers, oystermen, farmers, and producers. The Ordinary, a fancy restaurant. Do you see the irony in that? The Ordinary, a fancy restaurant. Fancy doesn't go with the word ordinary. And if you looked at their menu, oh my, that's a pricey menu. Ordinary is the opposite of fancy. Ordinary means normal, common, everyday, not fancy. So if you look at the Ordinary, this restaurant, and then you compare this with Jesus calling of these 12 men, if we took a look at the men that were chosen by Jesus, these guys were not fancy either. They were not elaborate, they were not elegant, they were not lavish at all. They were not some lavish group of guys. They were ordinary, really kind of nobodies. Listen to what MacArthur says in his book, 12 Ordinary Men. He says this, quote, "Not one of them renowned for scholarship or great intellect. They had no track record as orators or theologians. In fact, they were outsiders as far as the religious establishment of Jesus' day was concerned. They were not astounding because of any natural talents or intellectual abilities. On the contrary, they were all too prone to mistakes, misstatements, wrong attitudes, lapse of faith, and bitter failure." Oh, we're nothing like that. "Yet with all their faults and character flaws, as remarkably ordinary as they were, These men carried on a ministry after Jesus' ascension that left an indelible impact on the world. They were people like you and me who became the instruments by which Christ's message was carried to the ends of the earth. 12 ordinary guys. These are the ones that Jesus called. These are the type of people that Jesus calls. And he calls them and demands that they be just like him. Luke's theme in his gospel is a cry to all outcasts. And notice that's in quotes. So all outcasts, come follow Jesus, Messiah, servant, Son of Man, Lord, and find forgiveness of your sins. And today, we're introduced to something where Jesus calls the ordinary to become outcasts. And we're going to kind of unpack this concept of becoming an outcast, quote unquote. Jesus, he's one who calls the ordinary to become outcasts. He doesn't call great, popular, fancy, elaborate type people. He calls just ordinary people. Like us, you and me. And he calls us to be just like him, to become an outcast. He calls the ordinary to become outcasts. Or a statement for you, Jesus calls ordinary people to be his disciples. He demands that they become outcasts for his namesakes, to be just like him. This is the ethic of a true disciple of Jesus. This is how one of his followers would live. Just like him. So Jesus would train these 4 guys, these 12 guys for the task of following him. What it would look like for them, and what they should expect of others, and what they should be teaching other people. He was preparing them by way of instruction for the mission. This is who they will be and what they will proclaim. Which is why, here in the Gospel of Luke, the calling of his 12 disciples, it comes right after. What comes right after that is a sermon called the Sermon on the Plain. This is what Jesus is going to demand. If you're going to be his disciple, this is what he demands. You must become an outcast. And he speaks to 3 different groups here, not just the 12. Now, in the text, we're going to see he turns to his disciples, turns to these ones disciples, but then everyone else was listening as well, the crowds. So first it was the 12, and then a larger group of disciples, and then the crowds. Handpicking these 12 from the larger group, having prayed all night. And then teaching them what it means to follow Jesus. What will be expected for them. What will they teach others? And with a choice like these guys, boy, Jesus had to spend a lot of time in prayer. His message to his disciples would be this: love humanity as a way to display God's very character. God's grace in the lives of Jesus' disciples called them to live God's grace toward others. God's grace in the lives of Jesus' disciples, it called them to live God's grace towards others. As God has shown grace to them, so you do the same thing. And you'll be ready to be declared an outcast because of that. So first, number 1, Jesus calls ordinary people to be his disciples. That's verses 12 through 19. In 12 it starts with, at this time, he went off to the mountain to pray, spent the whole night in prayer to God. Jesus' actions were followed by long communion with the Father. This was his response to the rise in opposition from verse 11 that we looked at last week. Question: what if we responded to difficulty and distress like this? What if we responded to difficulty and distress with, let's say, just a third amount of the time? 20 minutes. You ever pray for 20 minutes? I mean, do you have a set prayer time in your life? You should. We should have a set prayer time in our lives. You ever pray for an hour? I might have mentioned this to you before. I had to take a class in seminary a whole semester, for like 4 or 5 months. You had to pray every day for an hour. That was part of your grade. Well, I'll tell you. First you go, oh, there's a grade, and then you hate it. And then you embrace it and love it. It's amazing. It's difficult to pray for an hour. Here Jesus prays all night. I mean, if the Son of Man could not function without dependent prayer, how much more is it essential for us as redeemed children? It shouldn't be routine, necessarily. It shouldn't be obligatory. It should be dependent prayer, right?
Yes.
So, a little tidbit of application for us there. So then, verse 13, day came, he called his disciples to him, and chose 12 of them. And he also named his apostles. So, the purpose of prayer was to choose or call his 12 disciples, which were from a larger pool of disciples. So there's a larger pool of disciples, and from those he chose 12. Each one part of God's sovereign plan. And notice the word later called apostles, which really it's going to be his specific authoritative representatives. Simply put, apostle means sent one or sent messenger. But in time, it would narrow into the exclusive, unique office of apostle that we see later on in the New Testament. These guys would be Jesus' mouthpieces and representatives of his kingdom. Okay? Now, I won't go through the list again, 14 through 16, because I'm going to bring it out in some specific details for you. But let me give you some important aspects to the listing of the 12. There's 4 listings: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then Acts. 4 listings in the New Testament. In those 4 listings, here's some tidbits of info for you. First, Peter was always listed first. Always. Judas is always listed last. Something else for you. The first 4 is always Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Even though there might be a different order. It might be Peter, James, John, and Andrew, but it's always Peter first, and then Andrew, James, and John, then always follow. And then you also see 3 groups of 4. And there's always a lead position that's always the same. Peter, Philip, and James, the son of Alphaeus. They were the leaders in those groups. 3 groups of 4. Now going through the names, just some specific details for you. Just by way of info, it might be of exhortation and encouragement for you. Simon, he's also called Peter, which means rock, so it denotes leadership. He was the leader amongst the 12. James and John were brothers, also known as sons of thunder. Philip was a typical disciple. He was always struggling to understand Jesus. Bartholomew, quite possibly another name for Nathaniel. Matthew, also known as Levi, the tax collector. Thomas, he was also known as Didymus. James, the son of Alphaeus, he was not the half-brother of Jesus. They're not really sure of his origin. Simon, a nationalist, a political revolutionary. They were called zealots. They could not stand the Roman Empire. Judas, not the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote the book of Jude later on in the New Testament. Probably another name for Thaddeus. And then you have Judas Iscariot. There's debate as to what Iscariot refers to, but they think it means man of Kerioth, a region of Judea, a region in Judea. So here's these 12 ordinary men from a variety of backgrounds. Fishermen, a tax collector who worked for the state, a political revolutionary who hated the state. Imagine a political conversation take place with those two. That'd be fun. A skeptic, 2 vengeful brothers, a traitor who loved money. Talk about a band of guys. Wow. If Jesus could use these guys, he can use you. He can use us. God's call to these ordinary men shows his call is always effectual. Always effectual, regardless of who we are. Our weaknesses, that is the opportunity for him to show his great power. He shows his glory in our weaknesses, in our ordinariness, in our normalness, in our commonness. Well, I'm nothing special. I didn't go to school. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. Neither did James and John. And they were writers of the New Testament. Oswald Chambers, he says this. Listen, quote. God has chosen and used nobodies because their unusual dependence on him made possible the unique display of his power and grace. He chose and used somebodies only when they renounced dependence on their natural abilities and resources. See, notice how this flows us right into the next part. Pretty soon we're going to look at that. He calls ordinary people to be outcasts. You must renounce your dependence upon yourself and everything else about yourself. This is the whole point of Jesus' teaching. God will use nobodies to show how gracious and loving he is. True disciples embrace his call, they admit their need, and they act like him. This awesome, glorious gospel, it's entrusted to common people, frail, weak people, so that God's power is seen, not our power, not how great we are. He chooses ordinary people to admit their need, to admit that they depend upon him, to act like Jesus, to become an outcast like Christ, preaching this gospel. Come and become an outcast like me, like Jesus. That's what he does. Notice what happens in 17 through 19. When he descended with them, standing on a level place, there's a great multitude of his disciples and a throng of people from all these different regions. And notice it says in 18, they came to hear him, to be healed, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were being cured. They were trying to touch him, for power was coming from him and healing him. This is a summary of his teaching, his healing, and his casting out demons. And again, notice the three different groups: the 12, the larger group of disciples, and then the crowds. Jesus' healing and his teaching, it drew people to himself. But he's going to call them to make a significant decision about him. And by the way, too, I just want to make mention to you from the text, the distinguishing between diseases and casting out of demons. Those who sought to destroy mankind, the demons, will be overwhelmingly challenged by the great power of the Son of Man. Jesus had absolute rule and authority. It expresses something in healing, demon casting, and also putting the requirements of discipleship on his hearers. So Jesus first ministered in grace and mercy through healing before he spoke God's mercy and demands in his teaching. So to receive God's grace means to embrace his demand to share that grace with others. Receive his grace by dispensing it to others with his same love. That's what he's going to teach them. In 19 it says his power was coming through him and healing them all. God's kingdom had come. His kingdom would be marked by great power. People would receive physical wholeness. And for some, simply by touching Jesus, they would be made whole. But then you think about this. Why would Jesus still heal these people? Though many of them would not know or even care about being a disciple of Jesus. Why would he do this? I think because Jesus was open to all people. And yet his teaching would counter their erroneous focus. See, God gives graciously. God loves to give of himself graciously. And to be Jesus' follower, you must serve as God serves. See, Jesus displayed by example what a follower of God would look like. You give. You give yourself. You give to others. You're just giving and giving and giving. And that's what Jesus did. See, it's not just mere profession. was up in Jerome one Friday talking with this gal sitting next to me. And she says, what do you do up here? And I said, I just come up here on Fridays and try to talk to people about Jesus. Kind of looked at me and I said, yeah. I said, that's how I roll. She's like, okay, well, that's cool. You know, you kind of ask Jesus to your heart type stuff. I said, well, I guess so. That's just not a biblical phrase, asking Jesus into your heart. It's like, well, she said, well, heart, that's, the center of a person, that type of thing. Well, I said, well, yeah, I understand. I said, but the thing is, though, as I said to her, I said, the thing is, though, that you find people say, well, why is Jesus into my heart? And say, hey, I'm going to get hammered tonight. Awesome. That's how people act. They ask Jesus into their heart, but there's no change in their life, right?
Amen.
See, Jesus is not talking about mere profession here. He's talking about a way of life, thinking, your outlook, your mindsets, how you live. And my, how the Son of God gave of himself. He gave his life for sinners. I mean, that's the ultimate way he gave of himself. So that sinners might live, so that sinners might have life. When they turn from their sin, when they put their absolute trust in Jesus. And then he says, come and die. Come and be like me. Be an outcast and just give to others. That's the message of the gospel. So this was a call to them, the 12 and the other groups. And this is what they would proclaim to others. And what they should expect if they're going to be close associates of Jesus. So the profile of Jesus' disciple: admit your weakness, be ready to suffer, and give. Which leads us to our next point. Jesus calls ordinary people to be a disciple. And number 2, Jesus demands his disciples to become, and notice I put blessed, outcasts. Because though you might be called to be an outcast, you will be blessed. You'll see that in 20 through 26. 20 through 23. And not just here in verses 20 through 26, but really the rest of the chapter was called the Sermon on the Plain. Jesus is splitting mankind into 2 different groups. Poor, rich. Humble, proud. Belief, unbelief. Response, unresponsive. Jesus-focused, worldly focus. There's no 3, 5, 20 different groups. There's 2 groups of people. As far as Jesus was concerned. Which one are we today? How will we respond today? Will you trust and rest in his promises, though it's a hard road? See, in this whole section, chapter 6, 20 through 49, Jesus would press his listeners to make a decision about him. Will they really follow him? Will you really follow him? He warned them that their choice would be a crucial decision. The central theme, be gracious and merciful like God. How does a disciple of Jesus treat others? Graciously, lovingly, with forgiveness and mercy, rich in mercy and love like God, and yet you'll be ostracized for doing it. So first, the ethical way, ethical call, and you follow him. Then,